Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this book launch meeting. So my name is Eric Fong, and from Sociology, and also the director of the Research Hub of Population Study. And thank you, every one of you attending this book launch event. And you may ask why the Population Hub was sponsored such activities. The way we think about the population study is not just only crunching number, running a statistical model, but I think what we want to do is to understand issues related to population. And we really think that when we understand about the Southeast Asia, definitely population is a related topic that we should address, and also ANSI will also address the population issue as well in the discussion. So before taking so long, let me just quickly introduce you. Of course, the main person here is Professor N.C. Hang, and he just published a book actually it's freshly published, 2024, by the Oxford University Press. And I think every of you should know the title, The Ripple Effects of China's Complex Presence in Southeast Asia. And Professor Hang is a very productive scholar, and he has published a number of work. And so we are very happy to have a chance to hear some of his recent work and his recent research. Just want to highlight one thing is that we have Professor Hang has brought a number of copies of the book. If you want to get a copy of the book, you can. They are put outside. You can purchase from there. And my understanding, he is going to have he has a signature on the book if you want his own signature. So Professor Hang is going to talk about his book for about 30 minutes, and then we are going to invite Professor David Palmer from the Sociology Department to discuss the book. Then we will open to the floor for discussion. So now I hand over the time to Professor Hang.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming, and then it's really an honor to present the book at Hong Kong U. And also thanks to Professor Fong for sponsoring me, right, in terms of as part of the population research series. And I also try to address some relevance of this book to population studies. Okay, so the starting point of the book essentially is there is a wide set of literature out there, right? Try to understand what is the meaning of global China in terms of as a result of the rising power of the PRC and its global presence, and how can we understand the implications of this multifaceted kind of a presence of China globally? And I think many scholars have essentially asked questions in different contexts. So my entering point into this set of literature and this set of debates, and essentially is trying to engage some of those theoretical points, and as well as my own intervention. The first one is that within the international relations literature, there is a tendency, or there is a common emphasis on the differentiation of the concept between power and influence, right? I think has been well established in terms of the definition of influence, of the ability to translate the power into sort of action, right? To change another actor's preferences, etc. However, in existing studies on influence, for example, there is on the one hand a quite significant amount of emphasis on the state. So essentially that people tend to look at the state as a unitary actor, and also the most important actor in the exclusive analysis. So many non-state actors often are ignored or omitted or sidelined in such analysis. And the second part essentially is about intentionality, is how can we empirically understand the intentionality of actors, and then the relationship between intention and outcome on the ground. So this is essentially these two theoretical entry points for this book. Some context, right? Basically, why China and Southeast Asia? Not simply because I work on Southeast Asia, but also I think there is specific element of importance of Southeast Asia, or that make the region extremely unique in a sense to understand the China's presence. And I think one of the unique element of Southeast Asia to China is because of this geographical proximity, right? And this, in some ways, makes Southeast Asia in some way unique, even more so than other parts of the world, even more so than other parts of East Asia, in terms of how entangled China has been historically with the region, right? Not only through dynastical changes, but also in terms of the most recent memories of the Cold War. This is a region where there's extensive sort of like political intervention by the Chinese Communist Party, and as well as competing regimes with Taiwan, right? Usually centered on Southeast Asia. And also what is unique about Southeast Asia is that this is a region that received the most amount of migration from China. And that is basically a long history of Chinese migration. And then the intimate relationship between China and the diverse ethnic Chinese communities in the region make relationship between China and many of the states in the region quite complex to think about, right? So this is essentially a few reasons that I think that to understand China's global presence, and in some ways to start from Southeast Asia, in some ways is a natural starting point. So the argument of the book essentially is not necessarily a thesis, but more of an antithesis, in a sense that I'm arguing against some of the conventional literature, right? So essentially I argue that, well, first we need to look not only the state, but also beyond the state, right? So essentially we look at many non-state actors and how they influence relations between states on the ground. But also we need to move beyond the intentionality argument that look at many things that happen partly as a result of the unintended consequences of things, right? So that's why I also try to basically engage these two sets of literature, like essentially arguing against, right? Essentially that we need to look at non-state actors, but also look at an unintentioned element of that relationship. So with that, today, with a limited amount of time, I'm going to talk 3 snippets of the book, essentially 3 elements. And then I think I will start with the economic dimension. I think that's the aspect people are mostly interested in. So first one is basically, if you look at the statistics, right? China trading relation with Southeast Asia has become the most, let's say, voluminous, right, for the past few years, in particular since 2020. That's when ASEAN, as a regional bloc, has overtaken the US and EU as China's largest trading partner. But if you look closer in terms of how this sort of increase in volume of trade between China and Southeast Asia has become, and essentially there are a few reasons why that has been the case. Partly is because of the trade war between the US and China, right? When Donald Trump administration basically put in 25% of tariff on made in China products, what that has mean is basically there is a significant amount of transshipment of goods from China via Southeast Asia, right? In particular through Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia, and many other ones, right? Which means what has happened in terms of the increase of trade volume between China and Southeast Asia essentially is a transshipment of goods that were originally intended for Europe and the US anyway, right? So that's basically one unintended kind of dimension of that trading diversion. Similarly, the US sanctions on Chinese Xinjiang products, particularly on cotton and other agricultural products, also meant that many Chinese let's say agricultural products from Xinjiang would be so-called cotton washed through Southeast Asia. So which means that those cotton from Xinjiang would be shipped to Southeast Asia and mixed with other cotton from elsewhere and then be produced through textiles companies in Southeast Asia and then in the end sold in Western supermarkets or in department stores. So that essentially means that, so what has happened in terms of trading relations between the region, in some ways, was an unintended kind of outcome of the geopolitical competition between the US and China on a very large structural level. Now we look at investment, right? Now, investment in some ways, I differentiate them into, let's say, state and non-state, private capital, state capital, in terms of the entry into Southeast Asia. Now, in terms of state, and obviously people are familiar with Belt and Road initiatives and its many projects in Southeast Asia. And in some ways, the Belt Road is specifically on connectivity, right? And with very heavy emphasis on infrastructure investment. So one of the, let's say, landmark projects, right, is the high-speed rail connecting, let's say, connecting China via Laos through Thailand and then Malaysia, and eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to reach Singapore. So currently, the Laos section has been completed and in operation. And in fact, since April last year, right, transporter passenger trains has been in operation. And then basically daily, there are one transnational transporter trains, passenger trains, plus four, one direct, eight basically trains going from Vientiane to the Chinese border. So what has happened in this particular case is the ability of China to set a standard of how this modern infrastructure, particularly the high-speed rail, is going to manifest in Southeast Asia. And this is in some ways unprecedented because in Southeast Asia, historically, there is no such transporter infrastructure projects basically connecting countries. And so this is basically one of the first, let's say, railway project that has the potential, right, basically to link these diverse countries through this kind of mega projects. And in this way, and I think the Chinese state capital is making its presence and also the ability to set the standard. But if we look beyond the Chinese state capital, right, and then there is also a variety of non-state private capital going abroad, and many actually are going to Southeast Asia. So if you look at the Chinese FDI to Southeast Asia, and you notice that the country received the most amount of FDI in Southeast Asia is Singapore. So Singapore essentially is like Hong Kong, but bigger these days, right, in terms of the reception of volume of capital. And then one of the main models of private capital from China these days is to make Singapore as their international headquarters. Right. So this is basically the strategy. Basically, essentially, it's like China plus one kind of strategy, right? Or China plus international. So many big Chinese companies, such as ByteDance, right, which is basically the mother company of Douyin and TikTok, essentially set up the international operation of TikTok in Singapore. Same with many other, let's say, tech companies like Tencent, and also the biggest acquisition, right, of online commerce, e-commerce in Southeast Asia, from Lazada to Shopee, right? They all headquartered in Singapore with significant amount of Chinese capital in their origin, right? And these companies, right, technically they're no longer Chinese companies, but they are the ones championing the regional commerce integration. Right. So Lazada and Shopee are building warehouses and logistical networks throughout Southeast Asia from Singapore onwards, right? Through Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, is trying to integrate Southeast Asia as a region for future commercial development. And I think behind it, essentially, the model is the Chinese domestic commerce model, e-commerce model. So that's essentially is how we understand not only obviously the state capital, right, in terms of infrastructure investment, but also in terms of private Chinese capital are making its impact felt within Southeast Asia. Now let's move on to a much more mundane case of consumption. So this essentially is about the implications of how 1.4 billion Chinese consume and what implications would be for Southeast Asian agriculture and also for its environment. So one of the cases I looked at is about the deforestation in Myanmar and also Laos, environmental changes. So in Myanmar, basically as a country next to China, right? And then one of the main strategies for Myanmar government before coup and also before COVID was to develop significant amount of, let's say, domestic agricultural market supply for the Chinese market. So at that time, we've seen basically a very accelerated rate of deforestation in the country, right? So according to Global Forest Change data set, essentially during the 2 decades of 20 2000 to 2020, that is basically average, sort of about 9.5% of the forest has been lost. Now, previously, people studied deforestation in Myanmar tend to look at timber trade. Now, timber trade was also in some ways, fueled by Chinese domestic market, right? Domestic demand for furniture, etc. But then Myanmar government banned the export of raw timber in 2012. So since then, coinciding with domestic economic reform, political reform within Myanmar, what has happened is basically expansion of agricultural transformation, right? In a way that expansion of commercial agriculture in the country to supply its two wealthier neighbor, right? Namely Thailand and China. And basically, but in Chinese context, because the volume is such, in a sense that in the end translate into over-dependent on the Chinese demand. For example, at that time, almost 90% of watermelon produced in Myanmar would be shipped to China, right? Essentially giving you an indication of how much of the tropical fruits and vegetables actually are almost unique, sort of singularly destined for the Chinese market. So one of the things that we looked at was the domestic Chinese demand for meat consumption, and also its implications on the animal feed market. Right? So this is specifically for corn, soybeans, and other things. So during the period, during this the decade of 2010 to 2020, right, there is, on the one hand, a global commodity price shock. Price for corn and wheat basically gone up significantly around 2011, 12, etc. And coinciding with that is that the domestic Chinese corn price for corn is also higher than international price. So with that, essentially means that Myanmar, as a response, right, when the price of corn is going up, and then there is basically a significant expansion of corn, maize cultivation in northern parts of the country that historically was more hilly. Hilly in the sense that it was never a major source of rice cultivation, right? Because previously, right, the center for Myanmar agriculture has always been lower part of Burma, in a way that it's flat and it's raw paddy rice cultivation. But this hilly part of northern Myanmar is more suitable for corn, because corn can survive in, let's say, in a slope of 30-40%, 30-40 degrees of inclination. Great, good gradients, yes. So because of this reason, right, the expansion of maize during this period basically are destined for the Chinese market. And then as a result, we see on the ground very clear signs of deforestation, in a way that many farmers basically expanded that cultivation, and essentially the region that closest to China experienced the most amount of deforestation during the 2 decades of time that we focused on. And there's very strong empirical evidence from satellite data to look at basically that is a clear sign of deforestation during the period as a result of the agricultural expansion in the region. Now I'm going to talk about the last element in the book, is that I cover one chapter at least on migration. And this is something I hope will contribute, has some relevance for our understandings of population studies. So how do we understand the relationship between past migration and contemporary relations between China and Southeast Asian countries? So I use a terminology, I think either I invented or I borrowed from somewhere, basically is that Chinese people, right, often is being considered as the familiar other, right, for many Southeast Asian communities, because this is a community of migrants that has been settling in the region for centuries, right? So what is really interesting is this re-encountering of the familiar other, right? In a way that at least since the 1980s and onwards, right? But most recently, there is an accelerated pace of out-migration from China to Southeast Asia. So this is basically a new set of migrants coming from all parts of China to Southeast Asia, and then they are making their presence being felt. So we have seen, let's say, tourists. Obviously, this is the most sort of a specific group of people, right? In a way that is Thailand, and then before COVID, basically about 10 million, right? Every year, Chinese tourists go to Thailand alone. In addition to tourists, but also you have retirees, professionals, right? So people work long-term in Thailand and elsewhere. So for example, in Thailand, Chinese and Japanese usually are the largest number of foreigners having work visa. Right. So in some ways, we look at the expat community, right, in Bangkok. Obviously, let's say the Westerners are more obscure in a way that because they are around. But in fact, the most number of foreign workers perhaps is Japanese and Chinese in terms of holding valid work visa. In addition, you have students and etc. also go to Southeast Asia for a variety of reasons, right? From all kinds of different age groups, from universities all the way down to people going to Southeast Asia for international schools. Like basically school age kids go to Southeast Asia for that purpose. So what is interesting in a sense that we have these kind of millions of Chinese, mainland Chinese right now going to Southeast Asia from either short-term or long-term purposes. There is these two processes I think is very interesting. First is basically this phenomenon, some people call it, it's called re-Sinicization. So this is a process I would say represent at least partly of some kind of reconnection of overseas Chinese communities, Southeast Asia with their Chinese roots. As a result of previous generations of separation from China or Chinese education, right? So this was more specific in the case of Indonesia. In a sense, before the end of Suharto's rule, right, Indonesia banned Chinese education and etc. So which means that there is this generational kind of a group of people never had this access to Chinese education, and then also the ability to identify being ethnic Chinese. Similar, you can say the thing in Thailand as well, in a way that there is this kind of process of reconnecting or trying to retrace the Chinese ancestral relations. But the problem when we talk about re-Sinicization is that what do we mean by Chinese-ness? And that's that kind of, I would say, the very interesting thing, in the sense that the new wave of mainland Chinese going to Southeast Asia, they're no longer only coming from the two provinces that historically migrate out, right? They're not going to be the ones from Guangdong or Fujian anymore, right? They're from elsewhere. So which means that the Chinese-ness they carry with them were in fact quite different from the understandings of being Chinese in Southeast Asia, which are in some ways very traditionally localized to Fujian, Guangdong, or Dejiu areas of China, right? So in terms of food, in terms of religious practices, etc., there is actually very different understandings of being Chinese. So it is on those issues, in fact, there are more contestations, of clashes of identification, right? What means to be Chinese, right? So the contemporary definitions of being Chinese is basically be able to speak Mandarin, right? But historically, if you are in Thailand, if you speak Chinese, you speak Dejiu. You speak, the language from your ancestral home, usually in Chaozhou, right? That's basically the language you spoke at home. So because this kind of reason, this kind of cultural contestation, right, in terms of what means to be Chinese, and in fact has wide implications for Southeast Asian communities in terms of I'll argue as boundary remaking, right, in a sense that there is a very clear demarcation or remaking of this boundary between the old Chinese migrants in Southeast Asia and the new mainland Chinese who usually speak Mandarin and also eat very spicy food like mala and other things, basically are often associated with the mainland Chinese cuisine these days, right? It's basically hot pot and other kind of Sichuan restaurants, etc. So I think this is kind of the one element that I think is very interesting to look at, this process of cultural identification, sort of re-Sinicization, but also contestation. On the other hand, as a result of this, let's say, migration, and then there is also relatedly the Chinese state re-entering, right, or intensifying its effort to engage with its diaspora overseas. Now, engaging with diaspora has been a long tradition of Chinese foreign policy, right? That's essentially deeply rooted with the earlier revolution, right? But also later on regime competition between Beijing and Taipei. So in a sense that, engaging with diaspora through United Front has always been part of Chinese foreign policy. But what is interesting in this new era, right? Let's say during the Xi era, on the one hand, basically there is this kind of China dream, right? The calling for rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But very specifically is when you get to Chaowu, right? Overseas Chinese affairs, is calling for overseas Chinese to assist in the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and also to tell the China stories well in the community, in the countries that they currently call home. And that's basically referring to the role that overseas Chinese should play in terms of facilitating, let's say, the improvement of the Chinese soft power. So in this particular front, right, I mean, you can see that the activities of the United Front, right, in terms of trying to lobby and try to convince different, let's say, politicians and other things in Southeast Asia for their political alignment with China, but also its ability to project China's influence in the region through Chinese media. Right? So one of the really interesting phenomenon I've discovered while doing this research is that essentially recent years, many overseas Chinese language newspapers in Southeast Asia has in fact been bought by mainland Chinese capital. Right. So which we're referring to, let's say, the old Chinese newspapers, right, in those cities, like in like 新鲜日报 from like, so 世界日报, 新洲, etc. There has been a new injection of capital from mainland Chinese media groups, right, in terms of the old traditional media, but also in terms of new media, right, through WeChat and other channels. So that means basically the ability of Chinese government to have its message heard throughout Southeast Asia through the Chinese language medium, which in some ways is very different from the, let's say, the Anglo global Western media focus in Southeast Asia. So I think on this particular element, I think there is element of evidence to saying that this kind of media influence is achieving its target or its a result. So one of the good example would be 2 years ago, there was a Pew survey in Singapore. So the Pew survey of 20 countries around the world, and then Singapore is only one has a positive review of China, right? Among more than 60% of the people polled by Pew saying that they have a positive view of China. So Singapore government actually was very worried and very puzzled, like what happened in this context, right? And then I think one of the evidence, I think later on many come up with is basically that many in Singapore, they do read Chinese media. And then the ones they read in Chinese media are very different from what you read in BBC or CNN. So the image of China or the world coverage of events, the tones and then the angles they look at are very different. So that's why the Singapore non-Anglicized elites, I'm talking about the masses, right, in some ways have very different views of China compared with other countries who do not have this kind of access to media or Chinese media in that sense. Right? So that, for example, for me, isn't an area I think China is making significant amount of inroads. And given that Taiwan historically actually has a sizable presence on overseas Chinese language media, but they are receding, right? Because they don't care anymore, right? When they're not Chinese, right? Why should care about overseas Chinese community? So that's why, in some ways, PRC is overtaking that area of space that previously at least occupied partly by the Taiwanese in that sense. So I will conclude in a way that this is what I talk about, the ripple effect, right? In a way that we understand the multifaceted kind of implications of China's presence in the region from many, many angles, right? From political, economic, and cultural element, but also in the book, I talked about the criminal networks, illicit economy, right? How the gangsters economy, gangsters are in some way taking over Southeast Asia. And also basically political implications of, let's say, rising authoritarianism in the region, how much has to do with Beijing or not. So with that, I'll be very happy to hear David's comments on the book, and then I'll be happy to answer any of your questions later. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Unze, for presenting this book, and congratulations on the publication of this book, The Ripple Effect. I think it's a great book. First thing I want to say about it, it's not too long. It's 180 pages, 150 that you need to read. So I started last night and finished it this morning. It's a little fresh. I only was invited to give this comment last week, so I didn't really have time, but it turned out that it's an easy read, and it really gives a very good overview of all the multifaceted, as you were saying, dimensions of China's presence in Southeast Asia. I think it offers a very richer portrayal of all the different aspects of this deeply intertwined and complicated relationship than those that you will see in the simplistic narratives that we will find in the media, whether they are pro-China or pro-Western or whatever you want to hear. Here you will really get into the meat of the true relationships between China and Southeast Asia, which are largely at the level or in which these, we could say the IR state-to-state relationships are really only in a sense, a frame in the background to a very, very complex and multifaceted relationship that, as you can see in the table of contents, talks about everything from I think one of the most important aspects is precisely the title of this book, The Ripple Effect. So we see in this book that China is not a single unit. It's not a monolithic entity. It is so many different actors, so many different populations of older and newer generation migrants, so many different types of economic actors, which range from large state-owned enterprises down to private companies, large private companies by Chinese tycoons in Thailand, petty entrepreneurs selling cheap Chinese products in rural markets, and even criminal syndicates and organized crime, which has a long, long history in Southeast Asia. So all of these different actors, who are all connected to China in different ways, are all influencing the country and influencing the region, influencing each other. We have so the ripple effect is when we have basically unintended consequences. We have different actors, all of whom have their own agendas, their own strategies, but all of them, it's not even one stone falling into Southeast Asia, but it's many, many of them. And then they create these waves that go out and then crisscross with each other. And so I guess at the end, the metaphor is one of, right, it's a sea with some relatively turbulent kind of waves going in all kinds of different directions. So what I'm going to do in these brief comments is confirm and kind of enhance perhaps some of the data that's presented in this book based on my own research on Laos. So going into one of the countries that is actually very well described in this book. And secondly, to put this study of Southeast Asia into a broader context of China's engagement with the global South, based on the research that myself and my team have been conducting along the Belt and Road Initiative over the past several years. So first of all, to talk about Laos. Laos appears in several parts of this book. One of them is in the case of special economic zones. So this is an important part of the picture that's described in this book. Several different countries, including Thailand, Laos, Malaysia and Indonesia have opened various special economic zones in which Chinese actors are invited to invest, and in some ways trying to imitate China's experience with Shenzhen and other special economic zones. So in northern Laos, there are several of these special economic zones. We have Boten, which is right at the border between China and Laos, and we have Bokeo, which is the former Golden Triangle at the corner between Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos. And both of these are zones that are within Laos, but everything in it is Chinese. Beijing time, Chinese money, Chinese cars, police cars with Chinese plates. Everything is absolutely Chinese in these zones. Now, one aspect that's mentioned at length in this book is the illicit political economy. So these special economic zones are hotbeds of the online gambling industry, casinos, all kinds of illicit wildlife trade, all kinds of these basically some of these entities, such as Bokeo on the Golden Triangle, is basically or was basically run by some Chinese drug kingpin from Myanmar who is trying to whitewash himself into becoming a developer of a modern economic zone. And when you go there, and this was when I went there in 2018 or 2019, before the pandemic, well, actually, it was scary because well, first of all, you go there and you're we're driving through the mountains and the jungles for hours and hours, and then suddenly it's like Pudong. It's just unbelievable. It's far more modern and developed than anywhere else in Laos, including the capital city. Massive casinos that would be right at home in Macau. All kinds of office buildings. Just an unbelievable kind of hyper modern enclave in the middle, literally in the middle of nowhere. Now, but what's scary is that you realize that this place has actually been leased by the Lao government for 99 years, not to the Chinese government, but to one entity, which is run by a corporation registered in Hong Kong. But it is this ethnic Chinese former drug lord from Myanmar who is developing this whole area. So you enter this place and you realize, and there are actually signs that say now, once you cross this, you are somehow, it almost sounds like one country, two systems. Normal Lao law no longer applies. But whose law does apply? It's not China. The police cars are Chinese. They're Chinese cars with Chinese Yunnan plates, but it's not China. So it's basically one drug lord who is basically the dictator of this particular enclave. However, we have these kind of stories, but what's interesting is that my colleague in this project, he was actually there a few weeks ago, and he said it was completely transformed compared to when we were there 5 years ago. And now it's far bigger. I mean, wow. But it's much more, now there are children's theme parks. It's much more family friendly. Again, it's kind of a Macau style evolutionary trajectory. And so what we can see in these special economic zones, and we can see this with Boten too, is that there is this, and this is mentioned in the book, these cycles of boom and bust of these zones. When they come in, there's a massive, it starts off with just very, these enclaves of vice. And gradually that collapses because there's various governmental measures by the Chinese and the local side to clean it up a little. But then it gets rebuilt a few years later. And then it goes down again. And each time it gets rebuilt, it's a little cleaner. When there's still that, just like Macau, one could say, right? There's still that element. So it seems to me there's a kind of a developmental trajectory of these special economic zone enclaves from, the Wild West into, more legit. But this is a process that is definitely ongoing. So the railway, which is also mentioned and discussed in the book, there have been many Belt and Road projects, and many of them have really had a lot of problems. But the Zhonglao Tielu is one that seems to have actually been pretty smooth going in terms of the execution and now what's happening. Josiba Esteves, my core collaborator on Laos, was going along the entire route of the railway a couple of months ago, and noting the kinds of societal transformations that the construction of this railway can lead to. And there's some very interesting things. Of course, the entire the space-time compression, right, of a country that had no good roads. Suddenly now you can get in a few hours from one part of the country to the other. So people from the rural highlands are now flocking into the capital city for short trips. So tourism going in all directions. People now learning about punctuality, and these are places where, right, mountain people, wherever the people would be late 2 hours, that's part of life. But now, we want to go to the capital city, and the idea of this clock time becoming coming into the culture. So many, there's some profound cultural changes that are being brought about by the construction of the railroad in these previously very remote regions. The staff of the railway being trained by the railway company, trained, again, the Chinese railway culture is one of absolute precision, absolute on time, much more than the Germans. And now we know the German trains used to be on time. They aren't anymore. But the standard was, so they are trained in a military way. So the Lao staff are trained, and they become proud of that culture, of that professional, that kind of military style reliability and professionalism. And interestingly, it is the women's staff who really take that on so much, not really the men. There's an interesting gender dynamic in this, in the transformations. So these are just some anecdotes that I wanted to share from my research on some of the dimensions that are described in the book here. And so secondly, what I'd like to do is to put the Southeast Asian case into a broader context of the China's growing engagement in the Belt and Road Initiative and the Global South more generally. Because not only, so as we learn and as reinforced in this book, China is not a monolithic entity, and certainly the world is not a monolithic entity, and Southeast Asia has its unique characteristics, which then when we look at China's engagements with other parts of the world, it becomes very interesting to see the distinctiveness of the Southeast Asian case. And one of the really distinctive aspects of it is the history of migration. The long history of migration between China and Southeast Asian countries. When going actually since the end of the pandemic, and I've been doing some field research in South Asia, in Nepal and Pakistan, and also in the Gulf region, in Saudi Arabia and UAE and in South Africa. One thing that struck me is that in those countries, so we're talking about South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, in those countries, people, and in some of these countries, China does have a significant presence, such as Pakistan and also Nepal. But in those countries, nobody has ever met a Chinese person. They have absolutely, obviously there are connections, but having interviewed and met with people from all spectrums of society, from political party leaders, former vice premiers, civil society leaders, journalists, think tank people, local communities, nobody really knew a single Chinese person, and nobody knew how you could meet a Chinese person, except some broker who was willing to charge me to meet somebody from the Chinese consulate. So there's like zero people-to-people, zero real people-to-people connections. And this is the case also in the other that I found, generally speaking, in the Middle East and South Africa. I mean, it's not zero, but compared to Southeast Asia, people have a rich and long and deeply textured history of relationships with Chinese people. There have been Chinese people in these countries for centuries. These Chinese people in these countries have been playing an important role in the economy for centuries. Obviously the geographic distance is not so far. Now there are new waves, right? Large numbers of Chinese tourists, which, as is mentioned in the book, doesn't necessarily improve China's image. People-to-people connections actually doesn't necessarily make things better. So in South Asia, people are actually, speaking of Nepal and Pakistan, where I've done some research, people are amazingly well disposed toward China. But they've never met anybody Chinese. But in Southeast Asia, people have long histories of positive and negative, histories of xenophobia, but histories of being aware of the contributions of China to their culture. So we have there's this depth of texture between China and Southeast Asian countries, which is quite different when we look at China's relations with other parts of the global South. And finally, just the last point on the comparative dimension. One thing that I found going into different countries in different regions is that how China is perceived, or how China gets into these regions, is very much shaped by what I would call the pre-existing significant other in that region. So in South Asia, for example, India is the significant other that Nepal and Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Maldives is always dealing with. And so their dealing with China is shaped by their perception of that significant other, which actually India is very perceived as a bullying hegemon by Nepal and Pakistan. And so that really gives them a default, very positive approach toward China. If we look at the Gulf countries, we have obviously the US and Iran are significant others that shape the context within which China comes in. So what's interesting with these other regions, we have significant others that have a very major presence, one of direct involvement and interference, one could say, whether we're talking about India in South Asia, or the US in the Middle East, or the colonial powers in Africa, and where people have very strong negative feelings towards those significant others. But in Southeast Asia, the significant other, which we might call the US, is rather more, at the same time, more distant, has a deep presence in this region, but it's perceived as more distant and relatively benign, I would say. The memories of the Vietnam War and the bombing in Laos are kind of receding. And so again, that leads to a very more nuanced relationship, nuanced attitudes towards China on the part of the local actors, it seems to me, in Southeast Asia. So I'll stop here. And so just to finish, once again, to congratulate Enzi and strongly recommend everybody to buy his book, his signature autograph book. I need an autograph too. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Anxi, for summarizing your book, and also thank you for David for the comment. When I was sitting there, always remind me that, like in population, we have a growing field within the population, which is the political demography, that I think more and more researchers find out that in order to fully understand the population issues, you need to bring in the political factors. So there's a growing number of studies about the political demography. I hope that in our university, the political science department or the PPA can have more discussion or dialogue with people doing work related to population. And I think this is really a growing field in especially in North America and Europe. And secondly, I also want to bring out the book is not just only for me, the way I see it. I'm not a South Asian expert, but then I find that a lot of this points are very much related to my own work and also from my previous experience, especially when we talk about the Chineseness, about the migration. I remember when I was in Canada, we talk about the Canadian Chinese study and among different universities, and one thing we constantly remind by the local born Chinese saying that the Chinese Canadian is about their parents, about the second generation or third generation, nothing related to the Chinese new immigrant. So the Chineseness for them is about their previous generation, what they experienced, what during the beginning of the last century and the end of the 19th century. Is unique. So no way for the new immigrants you can, using this title of Chinese Canadian. When I share with the Americans scholars saying about the Chinese there, they have the same impression as well. So that's what I think when we think about the Chineseness. The concept is not just about, apply to the Southeast Asia, but I guess it's to different parts of the world. And I think it's worth for us to understand more about what does it mean by Chinese. All right, so I guess we are now open the discussion to the floor. I'm sure there's most of you or some of you have some questions or would like to respond to some of the arguments made in the book.